I think one of the fascinating things about the whole crop circle subject is that we don't have any answers.
You will never convince those people who do not want to believe.
So we must have hoaxed that. It can't be true. So they don't have to think about it anymore.
One of the most profound lessons of history for me is the recognition that we don't know.
A long time ago, I remember a crop circle being reported in the local newspaper where I live, which is Lewes in East Sussex, which is about 3 hours' drive from Wiltshire. And many years later, or whatever, 6 or 7 years later on, that I decided to get married, and on a honeymoon we went to Wiltshire. And of course, when we got to Wiltshire, there were crop circles. So I had the chance to actually have crop circles all around, and I thought, well, I'm going to see some while I'm here. I'm actually going to look at them. And it's difficult to explain, but I remember the very first crop circle that I ever saw. I just remember looking out across the fields, and there in the distance, just beneath the mist, was this long, strange symbol in the crop. And inwardly, I think I knew immediately, just in that second, that life had changed.
I'd always had an interest in things that were strange. I'd always been interested in ghost stories, the paranormal, that kind of thing, and so the crop circle had instant appeal for me. I first saw my first crop circle on British television back in 1990. On seeing the first formation, there was something about it that was just so extraordinary. It was something that almost looked as though it shouldn't be there, this great big shape in a field. And the kind of shape that I hadn't really seen before. There was something very strange about it. It was almost as if something in the back of my head was saying, but you know what this is. And it was like there was a million words on the end of your tongue, and yet you just couldn't say them. They weren't going to come out of your mouth. And I was just hooked right from the beginning.
I had been an architect and a teacher of architecture, and to a lesser extent then I was writing. But I was interested through the middle and later 80s in the crop circles. I had never seen them, but I saw photographs and they were entirely circular in their nature, developing into the quintuplet or 5 dice spot. But I was interested, but certainly not at that stage engaged with this phenomenon. I thought it was very curious, but I thought at that stage that somehow these enigmatic circles could perhaps be explained.
I saw my first crop circle in 1982, and at the time I think it was, to me anyway, something that was probably linked to the UFO phenomenon. And I saw a picture of a crop circle in a local newspaper near Winchester in Hampshire, and it was just a circular depression in the crop. And obviously I went along to the crop circle to have a look, as many people did at the time. And I think really that is when it sort of sparked my imagination. And as the crop circles appeared through the years, leading up to 1990, to me, it was almost like the UFO phenomenon was trying to make itself known.
My immediate thought was that here is something which is from somewhere else. I didn't think it was aliens, I didn't think it was the weather, I don't know what I thought, but I just knew that it was coming from another place. I remember when I got back from my honeymoon, and I was very, very excited by the crop circles. And I think my new wife, was immediately somewhat concerned that I'd suddenly become very obsessive about these shapes in the fields. And up to that point, I've been a musician, very much involved in trying to make it big in the music business. I was writing songs, I was gigging, and that was really all that mattered to me at that point. But suddenly, here came something that I hadn't expected, something in my life that was demanding time, that was demanding more from me than anything else had up to that point, apart from music. And that really led me off into a whole other way of thinking, which I know is true for many other people who came into crop circles, that what it does, it suddenly makes you look again at everything you thought you understood about the universe around you. And from that, you begin to realise there's so much you don't know. There's so many layers of information and subjects which linked into crop circles, starting with UFOs, psychic phenomena, so many different aspects that suddenly you have to know something about to try to understand these shapes, because, the more people that I began to meet when we started our organisation, the more I began to realise there were so many different viewpoints on crop circles.
I didn't always live in the south of England. I used to live in the Midlands, in a place called Mansfield. And during the summer of 1992, there were several crop circles in Mansfield, because actually crop circles happen all over the UK, not just in the south of England. And during the summer of 1992, there were 4 formations, all within less than a mile of my house. And to me, it was like somebody leaving a calling card. And I actually spent many hours during that summer walking to these formations and just spending some time inside them and just thinking about what all of this meant.
But in 1990, really my whole life changed. As I said before, as a young boy, I was interested in the paranormal and UFOs, read many books and magazines, etc. But in 1990, we had a major event, major crop circle, the first big crop circle in Wiltshire, a place called Eastfield, Alton Barnes.
It showed paths and avenues and straight lines and a completely different sort of geometry. And it also had keys or claws. We didn't know what they were. It was entirely different.
So I went up there with my family, and there was hundreds of people in this crop circle. There was cars forming traffic jams along the roads. The farmers were going mad because they couldn't get on with their work, or the tractors couldn't get past the roads. I mean, it was absolute mayhem. It was a real circus, basically. But it was almost the whole of Britain had come down to this field in Wiltshire. And there was some magic in the air. It was almost like this was it, the major event, something from another universe, another planet, had eventually made contact with us.
And I took my youngest son, who was then, I think, 14, and we drove down to see this formation in Alton Barnes, Eastfield, the Carson's land. I was not to know then how important this formation was, how important this field was, and how important for me, for my life, was this event of going into this formation at this time. It was, I think, this event transformed my existence more than any other event, really, because I went into the formation and I never got out. I'd been an architect and I'd been very involved in constructing things and making things, and I was designing objects and furniture, and I knew how everything was made, or I thought. I was proud that I knew how things were made on planet Earth. And when I walked into this formation at Alton Barnes, it was clear to me that this was from somewhere else. This was other. It was doing things with the crop that I could not explain. It was doing things with the forms, with the shapes, that seemed to me to be extraordinary.
Just about a mile away from this massive crop circle was another crop circle which appeared on the same night, a long pictogram, which they're called. And on the 26th of July, 1990, I took my video camera to this location, a place called Milk Hill, which is about a mile away, mile and a half away from Eastfield. I went there with my wife at the time, and it was a very hot day. I remember this day quite vividly, a very hot day. And we were up on Milk Hill and filming this crop circle. We were there for about an hour, just taking in the scenery, just enjoying the day. And then suddenly, as I was about to leave, I saw this glint out of the corner of my eye. And in the field, flying across the field where the crop circle was this strange object, bright, brilliant object, almost like tin foil reflecting sunlight. And this object hovered, well, moved across the field, and automatically I picked up my video camera and started filming. And this object went across the field, it arced around, dropped into the crop, and it was glinting and flashing all the time. And I was filming all this, not knowing what it was, not knowing whether it was something mundane, something like a bird or a balloon, but something in the back of my mind said it was something important, something unusual. And this object went through the crop and eventually took off and sped across the field, went off in a terrific speed. It went over a tractor driver who was in a field in the distance. And the object went right over the tractor driver, and when you see the video, the tractor stops, the object goes off up into the distance, it disappears. Now, I get home and I watched the video back, and obviously this was something most bizarre. But from that day on, really my life changed. I became obsessed with crop circles, wanted to visit crop circles, and became more involved with the subject.
I think there was a feeling from some of my friends that, oh no, he's finally cracked. Because I was so excited about the crop circles, I was trying to tell other people about them, expecting them to share my interest, and of course they didn't. There was some curiosity, but by and large there was a sudden suspicion that, I'd taken a wrong turning somewhere.
Seeing the crop circle for the first time was like somebody from outside your reality pushing their finger through into your reality. It was like punching a hole in your reality, and suddenly the world, right from the beginning, wasn't the same place anymore. Just that little hole in your reality opened up a huge amount of information and streaming in. And so you began to think about, what does this mean if suddenly something like this can change the world? How might that translate on a larger scale?
I'm very happy to be in a state of not knowing. If I wanted to know, I could get a job in a bank and devote my life to simple adding of numbers and be certain every evening I know what has happened. So much goes out, so much goes in, end of story. I can go home and watch television. Next year will be my 14th season in the crop circles, and my initial judgment, my initial intuition has simply been reinforced and supported. But then I must also accept that this is exactly the thing that a madman would say. And I'm happy to accept that I might be crazy.
But when something like this comes into your life changes forever, and the people that are actually around you, your family, wife, parents, they can see a change in you. And if they're not involved as much as you are, or interested as much as you are, it causes a lot of strain on the relationship. And I was married at the time, and to be honest, this caused a lot of problems within the marriage, because obviously my wife was interested, but not that interested, but I was very much almost obsessed with the subject. So what eventually happened was that my marriage broke up, and we went our separate ways. But my interest really gathered and gathered and gathered. So it was really in '94 that I started the crop circle photography, which I do now. And I realized that this subject needed recording and really needed publicity.
From there, I decided I wanted to make contact with other people, because this had been such a wonderful experience, and it had added a dimension to my life that hadn't been there before. I wanted to make contact with other people and see what their experience of this was as well.
What you find is people will now come up to me at lectures afterwards and say, well, I've never told anybody this, but... And they will then tell you of the UFO they once saw, of the ghost that they once saw. Of one lady came up and told me she was a white witch, but that she dare not tell her friends. But suddenly people become open to you and can tell you this, and there's a sense of relief in them that they can open out to you.
There was a definitive spiritual aspect to the crop circle phenomenon. There was something that was affecting people on a spiritual level. It was getting them to reconsider the way that they saw the world, and even the way that they saw each other. There was something about these shapes in the fields that were affecting people on a very deep level. And that was very interesting for me, because part of my work outside the crop circles is as a therapist, and so meeting people and discussing how this very strange phenomenon was changing people and changing people's views and perceptions of themselves and the world was absolutely fascinating, because you were watching that transformation before your very eyes.
One of the more interesting aspects of the crop circle experience has been the very deep friendships that have been formed. I and all my colleagues have formed lasting and very fulfilling relationships through the involvement with the crop circles. And at this stage, after all these years, I have to accept that the development of close personal relationships becomes a part of this phenomenon, an integral part of this phenomenon. Very often, looking back, I find historically that the people who did not form friendships very quickly fell by the wayside in some way. They lost interest or disappeared. Those people who I still speak to and who I deal with and work with and have real respect for happen to be friends of astonishing closeness. I mean, I find this remarkable because we are sharing something that I never had before.
I mean, Michael Glickman calls it the crop circle community, which it is really. And in that community, you've got all different types of people. You've got people who are humorous, people that are bizarre, people that are got some wacky ideas, people that are scientific. And then outside of that bubble, you've got people like my parents, like my neighbours, and it's a different world. I live a different life to how they live. And when you introduce people to this subject, they don't realise what is happening with the crop circles, UFOs, whatever. They don't realise what's happening because they don't read it in the newspapers. They don't see it on the television. And when it is on the television and in newspapers, it's treated in a very sort of jokey way. It's trivia.
So I began, I think as most researchers do, to looking at the prosaic, going out, measuring the formations, drawing them, getting involved in some of the sampling and testing into, soil samples, crop samples, and documenting as well, keeping a record and documenting the formations. And that seemed like a very important thing to do. To sort of, it gave you a sense of purpose almost to go out and make sure that a good catalogue and a good record of all these events were kept.
I think one of the most exciting things about crop circles is the people that you meet, because there are so many opinions about crop circles. There's many different pathways that people are taking, and the more people that you meet, the more you find that they are also interested in other things, and they then open doorways into finding out about this subject or that subject. And it's wonderful because crop circles are acting as a focus for all these threads to come together, and you find yourself being exposed to ideas that you would never have dreamt of maybe in the years before you knew about crop circles. And I mean, certainly, one of the best examples that I can give of that was meeting a man called Paul Bura. And that led on to a number of experiments that we carried out with our group in Sussex. One of the weak spots of crop circle research was that there was no video showing you a crop circle appearing. And we thought, well, if you could have this video showing people a crop circle appearing underneath lights or from nowhere, obviously it's going to be, as we thought, much harder for the skeptics to deny that. But the problem is, how do you know when a crop circle is going to appear? How do you know what place to be in? So we thought we'd do it the other way round. So using Paul Bura as our main psychic, although we did use others as well, during our experiments, we started to convey messages and would say to Job, his spirit guide, right, well, will you speak to the circle makers and tell them we want them to make a crop circle at this place at this time, and we'll be there with cameras, and then that way maybe we can film a crop circle forming. So it sounds very naive now, but this was the idea. So we started to divine dates, places, through a long process of events which there isn't time to speak of here, but eventually we found a place and a time and a date, 27th of July, 1993. And we had cameras and we were up there on the hillside. Interesting to say, Paul and the other psychics had a vision of where we ought to be. And none of the people knew the place where we were meant to be. They just had a vision of it. And then using dowsing, we found a place on the map. And when we got there, we found exactly the things which the psychics had said would be found there. But we got up there and we gathered, and many other aspects, took place. But essentially, there was this moment where we suddenly felt something was going to happen. And it was just this moment of, this is the time. And we all turned the video cameras on. We had trained down on the field. This was about 4:35 in the morning, first light, so there was enough light to see by. And at that moment, 3 of the people who were with us, and there was a group of, several of us, it wasn't just 2 or 3, there was something like 12 of us, or I can't even remember the number now. And 3 people said that they saw lights over the field, a ring of bluish-white light appear over the field. Now, I didn't see that, but I think some people are more tuned in to seeing these things than others. And they said this, they said, we can see lights. And we thought, this is it. A crop circle is going to appear. This is the moment. But unfortunately, it didn't happen.
I wanted to know what they thought, what made them, their theories. I wanted to see all the videos of strange anomalies. I wanted to see this, do that, go to this conference, that conference. It is a distraction. I feel it's a distraction because what I do is basically the photography now. I've honed it down. I could have got involved with the research. I could have got involved with this, that, and the other. But really, I have to hone it down to the photography and do that as best as I can, because otherwise I'm distracted. And probably I could be a jack of all trades and master of none, really. But, I mean, really, that is my interest. Photography is my interest anyway. So combining crop circles with photography is great for me, but it's something I have to be focused on. And everything else that goes on around me, I really have to not ignore, but not pay too much attention.
So the first experiment failed. We tried twice more. We got no result. So we sort of reconvened in the winter and got together and thought, what went wrong? Why didn't it work? And Michael Green, a crop circle, well-known crop circle researcher, suggested that maybe we ought to contact what he called the guardians. And there is a belief among some people that there are sort of spiritual guardians who live in certain areas of the countryside. And that maybe we ought to contact these to help with our experiment. So we did this series of going around Sussex sacred sites, contacting the guardians of them, and Paul would channel them and we would talk to them about the possibility of getting crop circles to appear, all this. We thought we were going to get information saying, this is what you must do to get your crop circle experiments to work. But in fact, he said, stop trying to find proof. It doesn't matter what proof you get with your video or whatever, you will never convince those people who do not want to believe.
And then I think after a while I began to realise that that wasn't the whole story. And I remember one day sat in a wonderful formation near Silbury Hill in Wiltshire, and the formation was in a crop called oreseed rape, and oreseed rape has these beautiful yellow flowers and it smells very, very sweet. And it was then that I began to see crop circles as temporary temples, like they were these huge geometric shapes in the landscape, and there were people around me sat meditating, sat in deep thought. And I was thinking, where else do people do this? And of course people go and they meditate and they have deep thoughts and they think about the world and they think about themselves on a deep level, usually in temples or churches.
In 1995, when we came to this really last experiment of that type, we thought, let's try to get a crop circle to appear. Now, we had a certain place we thought one might appear. But we also had a certain shape we thought we might get, because we'd been told we had to play certain notes of music. We had been told we had to use certain crystals on the night. And somehow, divining all this, Barry Reynolds drew the formation that he thought might result from this experiment if we were successful. And we meditated, we visualised a crop circle appearing, and we went home. We weren't expecting to see it in front of us. That was not the idea this time. I think the pressure to expect to see the crop circle forming in front of us was leading to too much worry and stress, and I think that was not good for the experiment working. So this time, if a formation appeared anywhere that night, but preferably in our sight where we wanted it, we would have been happy. Well, that night, not in the site we expected, but, you know, a few miles away, exactly the formation that we had drawn appeared in the fields on the night that we carried out that experiment. And in essence, it was sort of 3 rings, 2 rings, and a single circle at the end. That realisation, when we found out about that formation appearing that night, was fantastic, because it felt to us like that, if you like, was the proof that we had interacted with something through some level of mind, through some level of some other intelligence listening in. We didn't know which, but that we felt that was our formation. And it was a lovely formation, many wonderful qualities to it that, as far as we're concerned, could not be explained by human beings making it. To us, that was proof that we needed. But we realised that would not count as proof to the big scientific world outside in the big wide world. And I think then, a year later, in 1996, when the famous, some would say infamous, Oliver's Castle video came forward, which purports to show a crop circle forming beneath these lights, we saw what would have actually happened to us had we actually ever videoed a formation appearing. Because I don't know whether that video is genuine or not genuine, but within weeks of this Oliver's Castle video coming out, the attacks that were made on it, the vicious scepticism from people saying this cannot be real, it's special effects, and the bitterness and the division that this video caused, and is still causing 6 years, whatever, later, that showed us that that would have happened to us had we been successful in getting our so-called proof video.
We had gathered that evening to do this meditation, and each of us, after the meditation, drew down on a piece of paper the kind of shapes that we had managed to intuit during the meditation. And I collected all the pieces of paper in, and I kept them. And that evening there had been 7 of us meditating in the group, which was about the normal size for the group. It wasn't always 7, sometimes there were more, sometimes there were less. But on that particular evening there were 7. Later on during the summer, it was the 7th of July, which is the 7th day of the 7th month. And on that day, a wonderful formation appeared at a place called Charlie Knoll, which is in Leicestershire, in the Midlands of England. And because that was kind of our patch, we were all terribly excited about it, and we drove out to look at the formation. And it was this beautiful cruciform shaped formation. It was the most amazing formation we'd ever had in that part of the country, the most sophisticated formation we'd ever had in that part of the country. And as we gathered to go and have a look at it, everybody had a feeling that this was very, very special. And as part of one of our meetings, I actually then got out the pieces of paper that we had drawn, and I realised, to my complete surprise, that this formation had 7 major components within this crucifix shape, and it incorporated all of the shapes that those 7 people had drawn during that meditation.
But I think the important thing is to show people what's happening and really to encourage them to get out in the fields. Because they can ask me, what do you think, Steve, about this subject? What makes crop circles? And I think that's too easy. That's too easy. I had to go through a period, I went through a period of doubt in '94, but I did truly believe that the majority of crop circles were man-made. And I had to go. A lot of people did it also, and they kicked the subject into touch. They said, "It's not for me. I think they're all man-made," and they've left the subject. A lot of people that were well known in the early '90s have left the subject. I thought, well, there's more to this, and I went back to my sighting in 1990, the video I took in 1990 of the ball of light. It was saying something to me, that video, because there was a lot. Not only did I take the video, but there was a lot of events that took place on that day, the synchronicities that led up to that day, that said that this is supposed to happen to you, and there's something here. So I kept with that in '94, and I said, well, I can't believe all this has been for nothing. My involvement, my interest has been for nothing. So something must be going on, and it's a question of faith.
Michael Glickman really was the person that introduced me to the concept of the crop circles incorporating some kind of sacred geometry into their design. And as I began to think about that a little bit more, I began to see shape not just as an arbitrary thing, but I began to think more deeply about what shape was. And the more I thought about it and the more I read about it, the more I realised that actually what shape is vibration. And that form itself is a response to vibration. And I thought, wow, that's a key. Because, you know, human beings themselves were all made up of vibrating particles. And although we're all part of the same vibration, the vibration of mankind, which is what makes us into the species we also have our own nuances which makes us individuals. And I began to think about what it would be like if, sitting in these formations, we were somehow being affected on a very subtle level by the vibrations that were created in the landscape by these shapes. And I began to think, what a fantastic way to evoke change within human beings is to affect them on this very subtle level.
I've no answers. I just see in a small environment how people are changed by seeing things like the crop circles and their experience. But how do you change the whole world? What will actually make that happen? Now, what I'm doing personally is sending images out all over the world. And hopefully they will see them, as people will say. Actually, I sent a book to someone who lives in Lebanon, and he made him think about different things, about the subject. And he talked to his parents, because he saw my book. He had a sighting of a UFO, and he then would talk to his parents afterwards. And he never talked about it before. And of course, they were slightly disturbed by this. But the book was a trigger for him to tell the story. So it's drip, 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 drip. I mean, what I do is really very, 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 very small. What Karen does is small. Michael, Andy Thomas, everyone involved with the subject, the crop circles, is very, very small. But and there's other people involved with other subjects that, you know, probably opening people's eyes.
The people interested in the phenomenon can be split. This has occurred over the last 3 or 4 years. Can be split cleanly into two sides, two camps. There is not a split between them. There is the Grand Canyon in between them. They will never meet again. On the one side, there are those people who are desperate to use big hammers to force the crop circles into a conventional current explanation, hoaxing, science, anything which our 20th and 21st century consensus will accept. These people are desperate to prove the mechanism. And on the other bank of the Grand Canyon are the people who I know and who I work with, who say, yes, the mechanism is interesting, and also it might be interesting to demonstrate that the mechanism will accord with some branch of 20th century science or mechanics. But I and my colleagues are much more interested in the meaning of this phenomenon. What does it mean? What communications are being carried by these mechanisms? The corn bends over because of microwave or electrical energy or blah, 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 blah. Who cares?
The story that always comes to mind for me is the sort of deep synchronicity that binds people or bonds people to one another. And there was one evening back in 1993 where a group of us in the Midlands had been meditating out in the open. We had been doing a number of psychic experiments with the crop circles. And consequently, Andy was also running a group miles and miles away, 300 miles or more away, also doing very, very similar things.
I was leaving a friend's house one night in the week that we were carrying out one of our big experiments, and I saw these two lights.
And this evening we had sat down to do our meditation, and we just began to get ourselves sorted and to begin to feel relaxed when suddenly somebody pointed up in the sky and said, "Look, you know." And it was a beautiful starlit evening, and there was the moon was out, we could see the moon. And suddenly, close to where we could see the moon in the sky, there was this object in the sky. And in fact, there were two. There was one larger one, and behind it, one smaller one.
One wiggling about, moving very quickly behind the other. And I'm not silly. I know what an aeroplane is. I know what a helicopter is, and these were not anything like that.
And we were all sat fascinated. It was absolutely huge, this thing, and we could see it in the sky. And we were all sat transfixed to it for a while before it kind of disappeared in the corona of the moon, and we didn't see it again.
And what I didn't know at that point was that somewhere else in the country, Karen Douglas was seeing the same lights when she was out on a night watch with crop circle people from her part of the country. And Steve Alexander was down at Alton Barnes, and
there was this strange thing in the sky. It was like if I remember correctly, it was like a large object and a small object. It was moving across the sky. First I thought, some sort of satellite. But I think if I remember correctly, the light behind was like wobbling.
And later on, it turned out that Andy's group down in Sussex had seen the very same thing.
And what's just curious about that is later on, because although we knew each other, we weren't really working that closely at that point. Later on, we all became involved with this communication work, and I just think that was a little calling to us.
And also, a man called Steve Alexander, who had been with a group of people in Wiltshire, right in the heart of crop circle country, had also seen the very same object at the same time, on the same night.
And funnily enough, Karen saw the same thing. And we plotted it on the map that this object obviously probably came from Karen's area first, went over the barge area where I was, and then down to Andy. And it was 3 people.
Maybe that's very boastful to say that, but it almost felt like, we were gathered to each of us see that, even though we were miles away. These things must have been very high up to be seen over that kind of area, and I don't know what they were.
The whole event was very synchronous in the fact that myself, Andy and Steve became very, very close friends afterwards. In fact, Steve became my partner, and it was almost as if this experience, this synchronicity, was almost a signal of how close we would become as friends. It was a shared experience.
I am very happy to sit here and say, I do not know what is going on. I have 300 different hypotheses, but I don't know what's going on. I'm happy. This notion is deeply offensive to the 20th, 19th, 18th century mechanists who cannot bear the idea of not being able to explain. It makes them very, very unhappy.
The way that I now view the crop circle subject is that, you know, that's exactly what this is designed to do. It's designed to make us look at the world in a very, very different way. It's designed to show us in a very genteel way that you don't have to have the answers to everything. I think one of the fascinating things about the whole crop circle subject is that we don't have any answers to it. You know, after 20 years of investigating the circles, that we still don't know who makes them, why they're made, how they're made. We don't know any of those answers at all. And I think that is a wonderful mirror for the way that, you know, that we can look at this world, that we don't have to have the answers. We don't have to be able to nail everything down. We don't have to be able to write a paper about it or have a PhD about it. That we can just accept the world as it is, and that actually the world is a magical place where, you know, where we can have experiences and we can take on board, and these wonderful synchronicities happen. We don't have to question it. We don't have to understand where it comes from. We just take the gifts as they come and we use them.
Crop circles, they don't give us answers. They only give questions. They're out there in the fields throwing questions at us. If they gave the answer next to it as to what this symbol meant, it would be pointless and nobody would believe in them anyway.
People often ask me how I think crop circles might change the world, or if I think crop circles will change the world. And I think my answer to that is that they already are changing the world. And I think they may change the world in several ways. I think the first way that they will change the world is that they do offer people a different way of looking at the world, and they offer people a vision of the world where things are still, there is still some magic in the world, where we can take some things on faith and that we don't have to understand everything that's happening. And I think that's a very wonderful gift for those people who are able to receive that.
What is the importance of crop circles to the world? I do not know, but I'll have a guess. And one guess which I've dealt with extensively is the sense that the crop circles are one part of a large array of phenomena which are supporting a dimensional shift. I believe we are in the middle of a shift of dimension, of frequency, of vibration, which is going to elevate humanity to a position in which we can normally, as part of our everyday existence, access components of our mind and our spirit which our culture has restrained for centuries. I believe we are now starting to touch again these skills and abilities.
I don't know what makes crop circles. I do not believe they're all man-made, obviously. But what I do know is that they're doing things to people, and that's exciting. When you show crop circles to people for the first time on a screen at a lecture, and you watch the expressions on their face and their jaws drop, and they say, I never knew this was happening, because the media never tells them the truth. That's an exciting moment, and you realise in that moment you've passed on to these people something of great value, and you've given them a sense of awe back in their lives, a sense of wonder, and that's what we lack in our lives of television, video games, you know, this kind of constant focus on money and the material. I think we lose our sense of wonder, and that's what these things do. Crop circles, they give people that sense of wonder back and that excitement that, hey, everything isn't explained, yes. And a lot of people get a lot of joy from that, and that's good enough for me. If I can do that for people just by handing it on to them and not telling them what to think even, good enough. I'm happy.
The crop circles show us that through thinking about our environment, that we can actually affect ourselves, we can bring out the best within ourselves. And so I often think about a vision of the world where when you go into a hospital, the hospital that you are in is designed especially, the environment around you is designed especially to evoke your own healing mechanisms, and where it will help you to feel better from within outwards. I also think it could change the world, because I think it's opened people up to the fact that they have a spiritual nature. And again, in Western society, I think, that is something that is looked down upon. I think we look to science to tell us how the world is and how the world works and how we are and how we work. And that is only such a small part of the picture. And I think if the crop circles evoke the spiritual journey or the spiritual process in people once again, then I think that is a very wonderful and miraculous gift. People say, oh, crop circles, they're just flattened crop. They're not. They are a doorway, they are a gateway into, our very selves, and they could change the way people are forever.
One of the problems our culture faces is that we live under an enormously powerful religious fundamentalism, and have done for 100 years. That religious fundamentalism is scientism. Our priests are scientists, and our confessors are scientists. And if those scientists transgress, they become heretical, and they are thrown out of the religious body of scientism. In the heart of crop circle studies, we have wonderful ideas, wonderful hypotheses, wonderful conclusions and studies. They are meaningless unless a scientist says they're okay. Scientific American says it's true. It's true. Smith, Klein, Beecham says this will do it. It will do it. We all believe it. No. We're learning a new life within which I am the laboratory. You are the laboratory. The effects of the crop circle experiment on me are very different to its effects on you and everybody else. And the lesson of the crop circles is a stupid question. There is no lesson of the crop circles. What is the lesson for me? This is the lesson. The lesson for me is different from you, and for everybody. And suddenly we are being kicked, screaming, into a new world in which there is no correct view. My view is the correct view. Your view is the correct view. His view, her view, that is the correct view. There is no one view.
Having believed that spiritual growth was dependent on knowledge, I was sad and discouraged that there was too little time to read all the books which I thought were required to arrive at the truth. Then slowly I realized that, in any case, truth has flowed within us forever, and it is enough only to recognize the deep current, to open up to it, and to collect it freely into your own veins. And thus I see clearly how the books try uselessly to describe that which, magnificent and in great humility, moves without a voice, deeply within us.